here at the American Prospect. We do this every Friday. This is our second to last weekly roundup of the year. Next year or next week, we will have our final episode of the season. And last year, we did like an 8-hour telethon for that actually kicked off this entire project. I don't know that we're going 8 hours this year, but we are going to have some special guests. We've already lined up a couple, so it should be a lot of fun. With us today, we have for the first time on the weekly roundup. By the way, I'm David Dayen, executive editor, and with us we have a co-founder of the Prospect, contributor, Paul Starr, Princeton University professor. How are you doing today, Paul?
Doing great, David.
All right, thank you. In our last issue, which you can find at prospect.org, and if you subscribe, you probably have already received it in your inbox, in your mailbox. You did a great article for us about immigration, which obviously was a huge topic in the election and is going to dominate, I believe, the headlines after the election once Donald Trump is inaugurated for a second term. And you kicked it off with, I think, is something that is fascinating and completely lost to time. At the top of this article, you mentioned how political attitudes in 2020 and 2021 were actually quite a bit in favor of more immigration. Could you talk about that? Kind of, I feel like that's completely lost to the sands of time, that we actually had a completely different environment 4 years ago.
Yeah, David. Let me just mention the title of that piece captures the two sides of it, the social triumph and political tragedy of immigration.
Right.
And part of the political tragedy is that Biden squandered the tremendous goodwill toward immigrants that existed at the time he took office. And I actually didn't realize this until I looked back at the public opinion data. And I went to Gallup because they've been asking the same questions about immigration since 1965.
Mm-hmm.
And one of those questions is, do you favor an increase or a decrease or keeping immigration the same? And I was amazed when I look at that data. There are only 2 years when more Americans favored an increase than a decrease in immigration. And those 2 years were 2020 and 2021. And Americans also felt, three-quarters said, immigration was a good thing. That's in response to another Gallup question, is immigration a good thing or a bad thing? These were historically positive numbers about immigration. And then you look 4 years later and you see that that moment obviously had completely disappeared. Now,
Sure.
by a 3-to-1 margin, people favor a decrease in immigration.
Well, I want to get into, how we got from point A to point B, but I want to start in 2020 because I had forgotten that I wrote about that very Gallup poll during the 2020 campaign. Because what I was noticing in that 2020 campaign, and if you go back and you really pay attention to what was happening, Donald Trump wasn't talking about immigration anymore. Like he had internalized that his position was unpopular. And this was a function of the controversies around family separation, the all of the controversies around what he had actually done. And he found it much harder to run on his record than to run on the fear mongering over mass entry into the country.
Yeah, it's totally agree with you. And family separations, I think, turned out to be, a bridge too far for them. And they also just didn't accomplish. Trump didn't accomplish very much in 4 years on immigration. He didn't have much of a record to run on, even for his base,
Right.
because in the end, he hadn't done much. I mentioned in that article the census statistics. Now, there are problems with census statistics, but I think on this point, it's basically right. that when Trump came into office, the estimate was that there were 10.5 million unauthorized people in the United States. And when he left office, the estimate was that there were 10.5 million
Right.
unauthorized in the United States. And
Right.
actually, that number had gone down under Obama, but it stayed the same under Trump. He didn't have much to crow about, even to his base on the issue.
Right.
And he had
I,
nothing to crow about to most other people.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think what we're seeing now in the transition period here is this attempt to elide the family separation issue. They're talking about, well, we don't want to separate families, so we're just going to have to send everybody home, which is going to bring up, another point of contention, which is sending people who are legally allowed to be in this country and deporting them, which is going to be, I think, the bigger issue maybe in the second term of Trump.
Yeah, it will be, but I really don't think they have a legal leg to stand on there.
Well, there's that problem too.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's going to
But
be a huge legal fight around this. But we saw, I think, and maybe you have more knowledge of this than I do, in the 1950s when we had what was called Operation Wetback. We had a lot of legal immigrants who were deported at that time.
okay, so there's a history going back to the 30s also of
Hmm.
mass deportations from the Southwest of Mexicans.
Right.
Most of those at that time were seasonal workers.
Right.
Um, they're what's called cyclical immigrants. They come in for short periods of time and go back. Now, some of them did end up settling, and some of those were expelled. Um, this would be of a different order of magnitude,
Sure.
and really quite different, I think, from those episodes.
Well, you mentioned the date 1965, which is the date when Gallup first started asking this question, but it's also an important date relative to immigration policy itself, right? So could you talk about what changed in 1965 relative to, the initial kind of restrictionist policy that was back in the 1920s?
Right, right. So in 1965, Congress reversed 4 decades of immigration restriction that had begun in 1924. Well, actually began really with World War I, which resulted
Mhm.
in a shutdown, and then there were some temporary measures after the war. But in 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act um,
Right.
largely limited immigration to Northern and Western Europeans.
Hmm.
And it was primarily motivated by the interest in keeping out Jews and Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe. Um, Asian immigration had long been mostly barred, and it was shut down firmly in that 1924 legislation. Um, uh, but
There was an earlier act, right? The Chinese Exclusion Act in
yeah,
the
there's a series of
1880s. Yeah.
actually a series of different laws,
Hmm.
running through the late 19th and early 20th century.
Right.
Uh, so, so then 1965, and this is really a kind of indirect effect of the civil rights movement,
Mm.
and also of the Cold War, because the racist criteria in U.S. immigration law had become morally objectionable to many Americans for the same reasons that segregation had become morally
Right.
objectionable, and it had become an embarrassment for U.S. foreign policy. In the Cold War, in that the U.S. was excluding immigrants from countries that were supposedly our allies, and so it had become untenable at that point. And
Right.
but when the 1965 immigration law was passed, this isn't in my article, by the way,
Hmm.
but it is in my book that's coming along.
Okay.
Uh, uh, there was really no expectation that that law was going to have a big impact.
Mm.
I went back to the congressional hearings, and Ted Kennedy says, opening the hearings in the Senate, um, the ethnic mix of this country will not be changed,
Mm. Mm.
and that's because um, the legislation had a priority for relatives of families that already existed in the United States. And who
Right.
were they?
Right.
Well, they're people mostly from Europe, white people from Europe. They didn't really expect that the legislature and the witnesses don't say anything to the contrary in those hearings. So they actually thought the main effect would be to open up immigration to Catholics and Jews from Southern and Eastern Europe. That was
Mm.
that was who was pushing for the law.
Hmm.
It wasn't, people from Asia. It wasn't people from Latin America. They
Right.
weren't represented in the United States. They weren't the lobbying group for that legislation.
And so how do you account for that change? I mean, I assume part of it is international law around asylum and how that got applied to the southern border in one part or another. But like, why did it shift to being primarily, when we think about immigration today, we think about Latin America. So how did that change?
Well, actually, okay, so many people misattribute Latin American immigration to that 1965 law because actually the 1924 law did not limit Latin American immigration.
They just weren't coming, is what
They
you're
they
saying.
yeah, they weren't coming. It wasn't, but there was no cap. And the 1965 law actually imposes the first
Hmm.
cap
Hmm.
on Latin American immigration. What it really did was to turn that kind of seasonal cyclical migration over the southern border into an illegal flow.
Mm, hmm. Hmm.
And especially later on when new forces were generating migration from Mexico, the law became a barrier to treating that as anything but an invasion, an illegal invasion.
Uh-huh.
And so that was the actual effect of the 1965 law
Okay.
on Latin American immigration.
So that's good background. And then we came to this in 2020, and all of a sudden, because of whether it was missteps of the Trump administration or what have you, this incredible interest in immigration again, this favorability that we hadn't seen up to the beginnings of that 1965
Yeah.
law. And so talk about uh, how we got to a situation 4 years later where it's almost the exact opposite.
Yeah. So I think Biden's humane instincts were to welcome people fleeing from oppression. He said that during the campaign. People suffering from oppression should come to the United States. Um, and at that time, I think not only Biden but many others, especially in the Democratic Party, wanted to reverse everything that Donald Trump did.
Right.
And so those border policies that had limited the flow were mostly removed. And then simultaneously, there are these events taking place elsewhere, like the collapse in Venezuela, um,
Mm-hmm.
like the war in Ukraine,
Mm-hmm.
other developments in other parts of the world that are uprooting people, that are pushing people, and they come to the United States. And in fact, the U.S. began recovering from the recession, the pandemic, and recession
Right.
faster than other countries. We were generating job openings. And so there were multiple reasons why people should have thought it was a good idea now to go to the United States, because if they got in, there's a good chance they could stay.
Yeah.
And there's a good chance they could get work. And so a lot of people in troubled areas of the world took that risk and made the journey.
That part that you just mentioned, I think, is pretty critical about the economic circumstances. Because I think if we look at the statistics, typically, in relative terms, immigration, border crossings rise and fall with the state of the economy in the United States. If it's like a magnet, if we have a good job environment, then we do see more flows over the border. Correct?
Yeah, the word gets out. These days, people who have relatives in the United States or who just, can find out online
Right.
can get that information and make the trip.
So yeah, that's one part of it that we simply had a better recovery and that became a magnet to bring people to the US. The other part of it is that so in 2020, because of COVID, the border essentially gets shut down.
Hmm.
And it gets shut down for a very particular reason under a statute known as Title 42, which is really a pretext by the Stephen Millers of the Trump administration to essentially say, oh, we can use this public health pretext to basically lock the border tight. And when 2021 comes around, the Biden administration comes in addition to eventually they get rid of Title 42 because of the courts, because they could no longer kind of hold up that pretext because COVID, was moving through its cycle. But also, what that created, I think, and I wonder if you agree, is a real pent up kind of demand for border crossings because there really almost were none for that little period.
Hmm.
So there's kind of a whipsaw effect that goes on, or bullwhip effect, I
Yeah,
should say.
yeah, there was pent-up demand, there was push from these other areas of the world, but I don't think you could underestimate Biden's policies. He
No, he
was
leaned into it.
he,
I'm not saying he didn't, but I'm
yeah,
saying there were also circumstances that
yeah,
probably increased and accelerated the amount of border flow
yeah,
more than there would have been if it wasn't the exact same analogous situation.
absolutely, absolutely. I guess what I want to say here is that, for example, I don't think Biden was really responsible for the inflation in the US. It was a global phenomenon.
Right.
The US really looks pretty good on inflation in comparison to the other major economies. But on this particular issue, I think Biden does bear responsibility. I think he didn't see the crisis coming. He let it go on for too long. He kept saying he needed new legislation from Congress, but then you know, only a few months before the election, he figured out, oh, I could act on my own,
Right.
but by then it was too late.
And kind of the way he acts on his own is yes, he changed some policies, but really it was more diplomatic than anything, right? He
Yeah,
enlisted Mexico to help him reduce that flow, and it succeeded. I mean, right now where we're at is below the average of the four Trump years in terms of border crossings, this is far too late, of course.
yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, it was um, it was an example of, unfortunately, of the kind of strong leadership that we needed to have just at that point.
Right.
And he didn't. He just didn't act forcefully enough, early enough, to make the kind of difference that would have helped in 2024.
Well, and as you said, it wasn't just sort of the loosening of some restrictions. There were some very specific policies that he took, like what I believe is called the CHNV policy, which is we're going to take in 30,000 migrants a month from, give me the four countries here: Haiti,
Uh,
Venezuela, what's the N in the C, and
Ni- Ni-
Nicaragua, and
Nicaragua and
is it
Cuba,
Colombia or
Cuba,
Cuba?
Cuba,
Cuba. Okay.
Cuba.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, go ahead.
So that's making use of something called immigration parole,
Right.
which was there in the law, um, but really there was never any public debate about whether this was a good idea. There was really, never any mandate to do this,
Right.
and um, and I think that's part of the problem that I talk about in this article. Um, so uh, actually, first let me backtrack and talk about the social triumph of immigration.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we
Back-
should we should get into that. We're talking about, oh, it's bad. We had all these people come
Yeah,
over, but
yeah.
the
But
reality is that this is a net positive when you have increased immigration. So go ahead, please.
yeah. So, if you look at that whole wave of post 1965 immigration, that's brought something like the 75 million people to the United States. About half from Latin America, about a quarter from East Asia.
Hmm.
And you look at what the consequences have been for this country. I argue, and I'm here drawing a great deal from a wonderful book called Streets of Gold
Right.
by two economists, Rand Abramovsky and Leah Boustan. And by the way, I just might mention, Leah Boustan's first job out of college was as a writing fellow for the American Prospect.
Oh,
She's
really?
now a full professor of economics here at Princeton.
Very good. The
Uh,
pipeline continues. Yeah.
uh, and and what that book shows is how successful these immigrants have been in the United States, how they've advanced economically, how they've assimilated, just the rates that earlier European immigrants faced. If you look at their Donald Trump, talks about them as causing crime and illness. Actually, all the data go in exactly the opposite direction. They've contributed enormously to the well-being of the United States. They've made this country richer, both culturally and economically. So that's
In
the
fact, there was like
background.
recent data that came out, I believe, from the Congressional Budget Office, right? That shows that you can attribute a lot of our recent economic gains to the increase of immigrants, correct?
Right, right. So my article fully recognizes that, but I say at the same time that if you think immigration is a good thing, you have to consider the people who may think immigration is a bad thing for them. And they may do that for all kinds of reasons. It's, I think, a mistake just to say, oh, they're all racists. They may be worried about jobs. They may have a static conception of the economy. It only has so many jobs, and these immigrants are going to take my job away. And
Right.
that's not a good way to think about the economy, but you have to understand people in many countries in the world are going to react that way. And they may be afraid of the consequences for their taxes, for the supply of housing, and so forth. These are reasonable things to take into account. And so, if you're a public official, if you're a leader, you have to make a strong case that immigration is going to work out for everybody.
Right. And I think that's really the key because if you think about why in 2020 and 2021 Americans had this goodwill towards immigration, it was not about anything Democrats did necessarily. It was about a reaction to what was seen as a cruel policy. There
Yes.
was not the statistics and the discussion of the social triumph that you just talked about was absent in the public discourse. It was there was not a great debate that went on about and any kind of defense of immigration on its own terms. It was simply that was bad. But now, there's going to be this pendulum swing in the other direction without the public messaging and the preparation of the ground. And so, when you're doing that, you're cutting against a ton of historical, deeply embedded
Yeah.
forces in human nature, in addition to reasonable concerns about jobs, which there's certainly many Democrats over the years who have discussed those concerns. So I think that's the problem: is that Biden's policy was not matched with any messaging, and this is a common theme of the Biden
Yeah.
administration. That it wasn't matched with any reason why we should be accepting of immigrants on their own terms in any way.
Yeah. And I think what made it worse is that um, instead of being orderly and under control,
Mhm.
the immigration seemed out of control. And that enormously undermined Biden. So,
And part of that is because of a tactic that was used
mhm,
by Republican governors, particularly in Texas, also to a certain extent in Florida, to bus migrants to other cities, particularly blue cities around the country, and we saw this have a a real significant impact. And you wrote about that in the story.
Yeah, I think that what Greg Abbott and Ron DeSantis did was smart strategically on their part. It ended up splitting the Democratic Party. It ended up weakening Democratic support in those urban centers in New York, in other places. I think that got reflected in the 2024 election. And and
Right. You mean when you say that, you mean that some of the biggest gains that Trump made were in large urban
yeah,
democratic cities.
yeah, and I think the most direct explanation for that has to do with these inflows of immigrants that caused housing problems and and other things and you know it's just a shame. It's the word tragedy comes to mind to me constantly in this discussion
Right.
because as I said, I think immigration overall has contributed so much to this country recently. I think even these new immigrants in the long run, to the extent they end up staying, they will also be contributors. But um, but those contributions now may be lost. I think this is also part of the story here. I think we could be at a historic turning point on immigration.
Yeah.
I think by squandering that goodwill from 2020, by generating these these political consequences by helping Trump get reelected, Biden indirectly may bring about the end of the wave of immigration that began with the 1965 legislation.
Yeah.
And I think if you look ahead, we've got an aging society, we've got falling birth rates. Um, we're going to need immigrants, and we could be greatly damaging our own future as a result of this sequence of events in the last few years.
Yeah. We do have a question here from Jared. Trump was big on merit-based legal immigration, the way groups like the Institute for Progress talk about it. Do either of you think he'll try that again, or just double down on anti-Asian xenophobia?
Yeah, so
I
there are
mean, Trump did he did a lot of uh, campaigning in immigrant locations. There's an area in Northern Virginia, this like popular Vietnamese restaurant that he campaigned in. He did get a larger share, particularly of Asian, but also Hispanic voters who may be affected, especially if it's a sort of mass deportation that leads to individuals who they know who might be legally here caught up in that dragnet. So, what do you think about that?
um, so on merit-based immigration, I think very possibly, especially people like Elon Musk and other tech supporters, they want
They
the
want they
ability to
want
bring
they
in
want those
tech workers.
H-1B visas. Yeah,
Yeah, it keeps their wages down. Um,
that's right.
so they have a very direct motive for that, and I don't think that will stop under Trump. And in fact, you know, how much will he actually carry out the deportations uh, with, let's say, agricultural workers, with construction workers? Um, these are potentially very damaging to businesses that support him, potentially very damaging to his desire to keep prices down. So I could well imagine him conducting some kinds of deportations like the Haitians in Springfield that um, convey to his supporters, I'm carrying through, I'm fulfilling, and these could involve um, millions of families. I'm not
Yeah,
saying small numbers. Those people with temporary status are totally vulnerable.
yeah,
Those were not provided on any permanent basis. Trump can end them. Um, um, there are people that have to let the Department of Homeland Security know where they are. So I could well imagine we're still talking about quite significant numbers of
Right.
people deported. But on the merit base, yeah, I think he's very likely to continue to provide, that kind of support to industries that support him.
Yeah, I go back and forth on it in terms of how intense this deportation is going to be. On the one side, I think generally you're right in the ballpark. He could focus on what are called criminals. And of course, the crime would be crossing the border, right? And so if you use that metric, then you have a lot of criminals. You have maybe a million plus. He could revoke temporary protected status, which is in place for a lot of immigrants from a lot of countries around the world. And maybe it ends there. But then I think about the sort of ideological bent of the people who are really going to be carrying out this policy. And that's people like Stephen Miller, and that's people like Tom Homan, who's the sort of border czar at the White House. And I think maybe there's something more that they're really aiming at. And then you look at this controversy, very interesting controversy about what the legislative strategy is going to be at the beginning of the Trump term, because there's this now split between the House and the Senate. And the House is talking about we need to do one bill that includes the taxes because I need the border stuff in order to pass the tax bill. Like it's a sweetener. Nobody's going to vote in the Republican caucus against the border stuff. And so that allows me to smooth over differences on taxes. And so we need it to be a one bill strategy. Obviously, the very thin margin in the House of Representatives is going to be at the outset 217 to 215, which means they can't lose a single vote if Democrats all oppose. Republicans would need to be fully united. So they have the one bill strategy, but the Senate is talking about a two bill strategy. They're talking about in the first 30 days getting a reconciliation bill done that is mainly money for border issues, which would include deportations. And they're talking about as much as $85 billion for that purpose. They also might add some defense money because why not? Uh, uh, but the Senate strategy is a two bill strategy, and then they pass off the tax stuff to later. Now it's very interesting that the House and Senate disagree, and what does that mean to actually getting the tax thing done? And I think there are really interesting questions around that. But what I've seen is that Stephen Miller is for the two bill strategy. And the reason he's for that is because he wants the border money up front. He wants that within, days of Donald Trump being inaugurated. And that will allow him the wherewithal because, Trump has never put a price tag on this mass deportation. He has never said, it's going to cost us this amount of money, blah, 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 blah. But sort of on the sly, that's what the Senate is doing. The Republicans in the Senate, they're saying, you know, uh, here's a boatload of money to go carry out your deportations. And you're going to have to build detention centers and you're going to have to hire more ICE agents and you're going to have to, do some actions in the interior of the country that are going to cost money, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting that Miller has lumped himself in with the Senate idea of this. And that says to me that his ambitions are higher than just, canceling temporary status and getting rid of criminals.
Yeah. So one of the things that really struck me in going through what happened on immigration in Trump's first term is how indecisive he was
Mm,
on at key moments. Uh,
hmm.
at times he would suggest he really wanted to get a DACA bill, and he would say things to congressional leaders, um, and then he'd be talking to Stephen Miller and decide, no, I really can't do that.
Right, right. This is the Trump strategy, right? Like whoever's the last person in the room to talk to him, that's what he ends up doing.
So it may be that Miller really now is in a stronger position than he was during the first term. A lot of the people who were in his way in the White House the first time around
Right.
are gone. He's left. So maybe that strategy you're talking about, getting that money up front, maybe that is the one that's going to prevail this time around.
Yeah, it's quite unclear to me. And I think the House, far be it for me to think that the Freedom Caucus or the House is the real impediment. House leadership is the impediment to a mass
Yeah,
deportation
right.
plan. But their concern is that maybe the economy shifts. Maybe they lose some special elections or some people die in office, and suddenly they can't get the second bill passed. And then we go past the end of next year, which is when the Trump tax cuts expire, and they all come back. And it becomes much more difficult for a variety of reasons, particularly around budget scoring, to then do something. Uh,
Gosh, David, you're really making me optimistic.
I'm not trying to, but I wrote about this. I've written about this a little bit, and I ultimately, you know, the belief certainly is that if there's anything that Republicans can get together on, it's figuring out what to cut taxes on. So, I'm pretty clear-eyed on that. But in 2017, there were guys like Gary Cohn, who he was the head of the National Economic Council, who were able to say, guys, this is what we're doing. I'm putting it on paper. These are the compromises we're making, and this is what we're doing. I don't know that that guy exists in the Trump White House right now on economic issues. I
Hmm.
think that person may exist in the form of Stephen Miller and Tom Homan on immigration issues. But I think I can see the concern from the Republican House leadership that we got to do this all at once. It's actually a very interesting parallel to what was happening at the beginning of the Biden administration, where they didn't really know, should we do one bill? Should we do two bills in terms of infrastructure, in terms of the Build Back Better stuff? And they fought about it for close to 2 years, right? And eventually got something that was sort of a facsimile. It was an interesting bill, the second bill, but it jettisoned a lot of priorities. Um, you know, the House of Representatives couldn't even hold a speaker this time around, and they have a smaller majority now that in the next term than they did in this term. And so the idea that there may be some bungling here is not entirely far-fetched, I don't think.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Well, we are living in, really one administration after another with, these tiny majorities in one or the other, or now really in both houses.
Yep.
And so, there's a great deal of uncertainty and potential for blockage
Right.
as there has been before. And now they seem to have everything all lined up. They've got the Supreme Court, they've got the presidency, they got both houses of Congress, but it's still actually very.
Yeah. And historically what we've seen, and I wrote about this in the opening piece of our issue at prospect.org, that the last 10 elections over the last 20 years, nine of those 10 elections have seen a change in power, either in at least one house of Congress or in the presidency. And part of the reason why is that, you know, a new regime comes into power and finds it difficult to get things done because of those small majorities or because of the high veto points in the American system, and or because of the paucity of ambition, difference between what you promise and what ends up happening. Look at just this week. Trump was named Time Man of the Year, and he had an interview in Time magazine, and they asked him about grocery prices and how he's going to get grocery prices down. And he said, well, they're once they're that high, it's hard to get them down. So, which is like the entire election was based on
Yeah.
high prices. So, whether it's for one of those reasons, the public then sees, oh, I'm not getting what I want about what from what I voted for, so maybe I'll try these other guys, and they just keep ping-ponging back and forth. And I think that's a likely scenario, frankly,
Yeah. Yeah.
for 2026.
Yeah. And, one thing hasn't been ping-ponging back and forth, and that's the Supreme Court. And
Well,
so,
sure.
we're in an era where the court is making the often the historic decisions, redirecting the country.
And that and in many ways the volatility at the political level in the other two branches of government is what is empowering the Supreme Court to make a bunch of decisions in
Yeah.
the because of gridlock, because of the absence of any kind of realignment. The Supreme Court feels very emboldened to put their imprimatur on things.
Yeah, I mean, even when Democrats have had majorities, they haven't had the kind to do statutory overrides of Supreme Court decisions when those are based on statute. And
Absolutely.
and so the court's just been able to roll along as, the dominant strategic long-term source of change.
100%. Anyway, by the way, everybody go check out Paul's article, The Social Triumph and Political Tragedy of Immigration. It's in our latest December 2024 issue. That you'll see the link on the side there if you're on the YouTube channel right now. We have about 15, 20 minutes left. And, one thing that's been interesting in this post-election period is that all of a sudden we're having a conversation that we didn't have at all during the presidential race about healthcare. And obviously, it's triggered by this very tragic, horrible act of violence, the murder of the United Healthcare CEO in downtown Manhattan. But all of a sudden, people are talking a little bit about healthcare, and I'm privileged to be here with someone who's thought a lot and written a lot of really powerful and important stuff about healthcare. I'm interested in your reaction to the debate. We're seeing, some obviously, look, I don't think I even have to say this, but violence is condemnable, and I don't condone it in any way. Um, I think what's interesting is we've almost gone back to the kind of 2008 debate, pre-2008 debate about the role of health insurers vis-a-vis providers in the system. And I want to get your thoughts about that before I comment further.
Well, first of all, I'd like to also put this together with the nomination of RFK Jr. and Mehmet Oz.
Yes.
So, in a way, these are both expressions of distrust of the system. Not exactly the same parts of the system, but overall, um, these are, um, in one case, violent, in the other case, coming, from um, the president-elect. Just evidence of the lack of legitimacy that um, the American health care system used to enjoy. And I'm thinking
Hmm.
back to the mid 20th century. Uh, it's just extraordinary. The extent to which um, an institution that at one time just seemed beyond question has now just come under um, such strong attacks of these two different kinds.
And to what do you attribute that? Do you attribute that to policy? Do you attribute
Well,
that to misinformation? What do you attribute that to?
I think these things were building up for a while, but I think the COVID pandemic really raised
Hmm.
it, in an even higher level.
Hmm. Hmm.
And eh, while that was going on, it seemed like misinformation was the issue, and Trump's um, you know mishandling of the whole pandemic was the issue.
Hmm. Hmm.
But now I think it now looks like a much more profound event for Americans' experience of healthcare. And sense of distrust, the anger that built up during the pandemic, anger
Hmm.
partly at public health authorities, lockdowns, and so forth. It just the long closure of schools. Um, just a lot of people got very angry at
Right.
at public health, at the whole system. And then there's this long buildup of anger about the health insurance companies, about denials, and so forth. And it all
Right.
comes together in this stew of hostility.
Right. So you see it as kind of a melange. I want to ask you about this aspect of it because I think it's kind of interesting. So, in the aftermath of this, I've seen a couple articles, things like that, about how it's kind of harkening back to the old Atul Gawande story that was in the New Yorker about how the most expensive instrument in a doctor's office is the pen. That you know insurers, they're the cost containers in the system maybe, and we're trying. It's providers that jack up the prices, and that's why we have a more expensive healthcare system. And I don't know that I feel like that's kind of an obsolete way of looking at the modern healthcare system. Now, we've written a lot about healthcare. We have a whole section called the business of healthcare. Maybe we can get the chat. We can get that link up in the chat. But United Health is the largest employer of doctors in the United States of America. United Health owns surgical centers. They own home health companies. They own hospice companies. They own all kinds of. They're the second largest pharmacy benefit manager. They own a bank that actually works on flexible spending accounts and also gives advances to doctors when their claims aren't processed by United Health. That's what the part of what the bank does, Optum Bank. The idea that you can set up this sort of adversarial relationship on both sides of the healthcare transaction, I don't think is true anymore. We're seeing these healthcare supermarkets out there that really change the equation.
So, so David, I wrote a book in 1982 called The Social Transformation of American Medicine. The last chapter of that book is called The Coming of the Corporation. It's, I've been writing about these developments for a long time. Uh, and this, I mean, there was the growth of the corporate form in healthcare. And as part of that, the growth of the for-profit corporate form. And um, that's that's um, that's a development that had long been limited in healthcare after it had, you know, covered most of the rest of the economy.
There
Um,
are laws. There are laws in 30 some odd states called the corporate practice of
yeah,
medicine laws, right?
yeah, yeah. They date to the late 1800s and early 1900s. I have in my book, you can read the whole history of that,
Yeah,
of how doctors struggled successfully for a long time to keep corporations out of healthcare,
right,
and then why it broke down.
right,
Um, by the 1980s, which was when I was first writing about it. When I wrote about it, it was news. Um,
right.
uh,
It's no longer news.
no longer news, but
Right.
it's progressed through a whole series of stages. You know, um, and um, and now it's that uneasiness about this change, the resentments against it, they are all you know coming out again with the murder of Brian Thompson.
We saw this week a bill introduced by Elizabeth Warren and Josh Hawley that would be what I've heard described as a Glass-Steagall for healthcare, to separate certain business lines. In particular, in this bill, it is to separate the insurance sector from the pharmacy benefit management sector. Those basically that happened over the last 10 years that all the three major pharmacy benefit managers have allied, been gobbled up by health insurance companies, CVS and Caremark with Aetna, United Health and Optum, and Express Scripts is with Cigna. So that I thought was an interesting development, and something about the vertical integration that I want to get your reaction to. It seems to me that the medical loss ratio, this was something that was in the Affordable Care Act, which I thought was a good idea. Al Franken put it out there, and what the medical loss ratio said was something between 80 and 85% of all premium revenue from a health insurance company has to go to patient care. And so it required a certain level of care. And the thought was, okay, they can't do this many denials because they actually have to spend money on care relative to their premiums. And if they don't spend that money, then they'll have to rebate some of the premiums back to their customers. So that was the idea, right? And it seems to me that what health insurance companies have done over the last 15 years is thought, okay, if we just increase the denominator of that percentage, then we get to keep more of that in terms of raw dollars. It incentivized these companies to get a bigger and get vertical, so that there's an incredible stat that United Health, 27% of its revenue comes from itself, because it's coming from doctors who are getting reimbursed, who are United Health doctors by United Health. And so what do you think about that? Like, I thought the medical loss ratio was a good idea, but do we think that incentivized some of this conduct?
Yeah, I don't know enough about that, honestly, and you probably know more than I do.
Okay.
But we also lost during this period, any of the antitrust controls that had formally applied in healthcare, um, and to the rest of the economy. But there were some very important antitrust decisions going back to the 1940s that specifically had to do with
Mm,
uh, with healthcare. And in the 1990s, um, I think it was during the Clinton years that the Federal Trade Commission lost like seven suits in a row,
mm.
seven major cases in a row on hospital consolidations and other kinds of
Hospital
things.
mergers in particular.
Well, yeah, they're partly hospitals and partly other facilities,
Okay.
and basically there was just no way of limiting this process of consolidation that has resulted in many metropolitan areas where there's basically one big healthcare system that controls like 80% of the beds, and you
Yeah.
know and so forth, and it's just part of the massive failure to maintain um, elementary basis of competition.
Yeah.
um, and so that's made all of this worse.
Yeah. The current crop of Biden antitrust enforcers have several cases on healthcare, some of which they were successful on in blocking additional hospital mergers. There's a case where the FTC sued a private equity firm that was buying up all of the anesthesia practices in the state of Texas and then jacking up the price. That's certainly in progress. There's a proposal. It's interesting. The very first challenge that this new regime took was between United Healthcare and Change Healthcare, which is a billing kind of software tool that was hacked and like caused this unbelievable tumult in the system this year. A judge allowed that one to go through, and then one of the last challenges is also United Health trying to buy Amedisys, which is the third largest home health company in the United States. I believe UHC is the second largest. So this would create, basically go from three to two. And that's in court now. And actually, because we actually got good news on that this week. It's a little complicated, but there's a divestiture in within that merger to say, oh, we'll just get competition by other means. We'll divest into this other firm, and that firm is like falling apart, and so the divestiture might not work, and so the merger might not work. But so we've seen, my point is that we've seen some pushback to this and at least some recognition of this competition problem within healthcare. But of course, this week we learned that Andrew Ferguson, who is a current FTC commissioner and a former counselor to Mitch McConnell, is going to take over the FTC for Lena Khan. They're going to add another Republican named Mark Meador, who was a Mike Lee staffer, who's a little bit better on some issues. But Ferguson is a kind of down the line doctrinaire, kind of pro-business Republican. And, he's talking about, yeah, maybe we'll take on the tech industry, but probably around censorship issues, which, is like the only thing that Republicans talk about when they talk about big tech. So the expectation is that whether it's on healthcare or anything else, we're going to see a rollback in antitrust enforcement relative to the last 4 years, just at a time when things were getting rolling. This week, we learned the Albertsons Kroger merger. The FTC successfully blocked that. They got a favorable ruling. The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department got a favorable ruling in a case involving one of these rental price fixing algorithms, saying that, yes, if a bunch of landlords give information to a third party and that third party uses that information to recommend rent prices higher and colludes, then that's just the same as if those three CEOs went into a room, those landlords, and said, let's raise prices. They got that ruling this week. So it's like, again, a triumphant tragedy. Actually, we end where we begin. We've seen a real run of positive things happening on antitrust, and yet, here we're headed into a new administration that's probably not going to take it as seriously.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been the pattern for a while, that on this kind of issue, you get a little bit of progress. I mean, in this case, it's some very significant progress in a Democratic administration, and then it gets undone when Republicans come back in.
Right. And it's up to Democrats usually spending the first couple years of any kind of Democratic administration cleaning up the mess
Yep.
from the Republican administration. So, obviously we're going to be watching that at the Prospect. And Paul Starr, I want to thank you for being here. This was an excellent discussion. As I said, next week is going to be our final weekly roundup of the year. We're going to have some special guests. Should be a lot of fun. We're in the middle of our end of the year fundraising campaign. The Prospect's been here for 35 years, telling stories of ideas, politics, and power, and we have a lot of experience in holding Republican administrations accountable, sadly enough, in that 30-year stretch. So, this is something we're poised to do. You can go to prospect.org/donate if you want to help out with our end of the year rush. We are planning some really interesting and exciting stuff in the new year and in the weeks and months ahead. And we'd love to have you be part of it. So if you can check that out, prospect.org/donate. I'm Dave Dayen, the executive editor. We will be back next week, as I said, and this will be available online in later on today at prospect.org. So tell your friends. Thank you very much. Thanks, Paul, and have a